Well, I think that we've been under a state of disaster now for almost 700 days. Any augmentation methods or preparation that government would need to do that hasn't been done by now is highly unlikely to be in effect. We've also reached the point where the virus is no longer as virulent or dangerous as it was. Hospitalizations are low, the mortality rate is low, and we've also seen the Omicron variant is nowhere near as dangerous as any of the other third waves. Therefore, as government has always said, they're led by the science. To have put the disaster in place, they should be led by the science to exit the state of disaster. There's significant curtailment of civil liberties and also certainty under a state of disaster. And obviously it gives ministers, but also an unelected small body called the National Coronavirus Command Council, significant powers to determine the everyday lives of South Africans outside of any input whatsoever from the elected legislators in Parliament. So for our democratic health, our social health, but also for certainty in business and tourism and the education system, we need to end the state of disaster. And if at a later stage there's a fifth or sixth wave where we're required again, it can be reinstituted. But it makes no sense to keep South Africa in this constant state of disaster when the science is telling us something completely different.
You make mention of the National Coronavirus Command Council. We heard Health Minister Dr. Joe Phaahla speaking about how a government is working on new proposals to lift South Africa's national state of disaster. He spoke about how he's going to be working with different departments like the Justice Department as well as the Cooperative Governance to really go to the Command Council and give their presentation, perhaps a move that could see the President announce some changes.
Well, it's an unelected body, the National Coronavirus Command Council, and they currently have significant power over South Africa, more power than the Parliament, made up of elected representatives, has. It cannot be right that in a functioning constitutional democracy, a state of disaster can be kept in place for time immemorial. I mean, if Dr. Dlamini-Zuma wants to keep it in place for another 5 months, 5 years, or a decade, she could do so at the stroke of a pen. And as I said at the beginning of the state of disaster, that it's going to give ministers and small unelected bodies power that they're going to be very reluctant to give up. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Government ministers have got far too used to ruling by diktat and outside the bounds of parliamentary accountability. It's convenient to have a National Coronavirus Command Council where that's not answerable to anybody, that doesn't have to appear under any oversight committee before Parliament or answer for the decisions that it's making to the public and to the elected representatives of the country. This obviously suits people who are power hungry and like to consolidate power in small hands. It's bad news for citizens and it's bad news for a functioning, healthy democracy to have a National Coronavirus Command Council at all. There's no reason government can't publish regulations. They cannot bring a particular piece of legislation to the floor of Parliament for us to have a discussion on how we take this forward. But to have a small unelected body essentially running the country or not answerable to anybody, I think is a very unhealthy situation for our democracy. And as citizens, I think we should be rightly concerned about it.
What about the notion that the national state of disaster is still needed to give effect to the standing lockdown restrictions like the public mask mandate?
Well, I think that, as I said, that could be a published regulation that could be published through a government gazette. They could even bring a bill to Parliament if that's what they would like, that for the duration of any airborne virus pandemic, that it makes it mandatory for public mask wearing. As I said, they've had almost 700 days to put all these in place. Why on earth do we need to keep it in place? It's almost like, as I've said in the press release that we issued, it's almost like keeping the country in a state of disaster in case there's an earthquake 2 months' time, or in case there's an outbreak of something else 6 months away. The time has come for us to regain our civil liberties, to get South Africa and our economy back on a footing. We've seen massive unemployment as a result of the uncertainty in whether we're going to go into another lockdown, whether the state of disaster is going to continue. And it's had a big impact, particularly on the education sector, where children have essentially lost almost 50% of their schooling last year. And this has disproportionately affected learners from poorer communities, where you've had this rotational schooling going on. We already have one of the most unequal countries in the world. All that is going to do is to continue to generate even further inequality in South Africa and set poorer learners from poorer communities even further back in their opportunities going forward.
Poorer learners from poorer communities also speaks to perhaps the reason why rotational learning may be necessary, because of the number of learners per class who, may not be able to abide by any sort of, social distancing, and also perhaps now increase the chances of a further, crisis when it comes to COVID-19 and the spread, and not much control of what may happen.
Well, younger children are less susceptible, and they always have been, to the transmission or serious illness as a result of COVID-19. Young deaths are virtually a single percentage. It has always affected vulnerable groups and older individuals. But let me tell you this, that rotational schooling is going to have a far more devastating effect on South Africa's future than anything that has happened under this pandemic. We already have, as I've said, one of the most unequal societies in the world. We already have one of the lowest literacy rates. We have one of the largest school dropout rates. And we have some of the worst maths and science results on the continent. A population where its young people are being given a quality education is one of the best ways to address inequality. What this decision is doing, and what you always have to do in a situation like this, is balance the various issues to make sure you come up with the right solution. Rotational learning is not the right solution, and the long-term impact it's going to have on that generation of South Africans is going to be a legacy that South Africa lives with for a long time if we don't get children back to school, catch up the work that's been lost, and give them the best shot of education for a better future.
You make mention, if we can go back to the Disaster Management Act and its management and the power, of course, over the control of COVID-19. We heard President Cyril Ramaphosa in November saying that his government has already started the process of amending health regulations so that they can then review the Disaster Act. And, the extension now clearly points to government's reliance on this regulation. What do you think needs to be done, to move us further as a country? You speak about the heavy impact on the economy, the number of people who've lost jobs, and the impact on the education sector.
Well, I think that we all accept that there are things that we have to do to responsibly get through this. And I think that there's no South Africans who really are objecting to wearing masks in indoor gatherings, etc. And so I don't think there's going to be a lot of resistance for that type of regulation. But for goodness sake, publish the regulation then. You've had over 700 days, you've had almost 2 years to bring a regulation to Parliament, or to publish it under health powers in one of the government gazettes. Why is government continuously hiding behind the state of disaster to do that? And the reason is because it has provided a loophole for them to bypass political accountability and to bypass oversight. A lot of things have happened under the guise of COVID-19. I think of the border fence that was done, where 30 million rands worth of citizens' money was spent on building up these emergency COVID regulations, with a mask for the scandal that engulfed the former health minister, Zweli Mkhize. All over the country, COVID-19 regulations, PPE procurement, because parliamentary oversight has been absent, thanks to the Disaster Management Act and the skirt that it gives ministers and those in authority to hide behind and prevent oversight and accountability, has led to even further corruption and mismanagement. It makes no sense to keep it in place. We're also in court at the moment challenging the constitutionality of the particular piece of legislation. We don't believe it's right that one minister, at the stroke of a pen, can keep South Africa in a state of disaster with no reference whatsoever to Parliament and the people who've been elected by the citizens of the country to represent them. We believe that if there is to be a state of disaster and there are to be extensions, that there should be at least some reference to Parliament, so that the elected representatives of the country can represent the people of South Africa in determining whether these should continue or not.